All right, so midpoint. What is a midpoint of a segment? Sounds like middle. Midpoint is really the middle. It's the point at the middle. And a segment is a line that has two endpoints. So just to make it clear, here's an example of a line segment. Okay, so it doesn't have arrows, meaning it goes forever, but it has an endpoint. So that is the point at which we have we are equidistant from both endpoints. What does that mean? So if this is the midpoint, if this is M, it means that the distance between M and this endpoint and the other endpoint, okay, so I could call them like A and B, is equal. So the distance here from B to M is also the same as the distance from A to M, okay? So that is, by definition, what a midpoint is, the halfway point between the two, okay? So here we have a segment from A to B, as we're going to use that example. So let's go through the investigations. What are the x coordinates of A and B? Let's just, first of all, what are the coordinates here? So this would be -3, 0. And so the x coordinate is the first coordinate, y is the second, and then the other example is 5, 0. So these are the coordinates, again, x and y. So the x coordinates are -3 and 5. And what's the average of the x coordinates? So if we add those together and then divide it by the number, which is 2 of them, so -3 plus 5, we know that's 2, divided by 2 is 1, right? So the average is at 1. What number is halfway between the x coordinates? Okay, one way we could look at what's the halfway point is like, okay, so I'm going to go 1 unit here, and then I go 1 unit here. Let's go a couple more to speed this up. There's a 3 units, so I go 3 units here, 2, 3. Oh, I can see that here, if I go, it's exactly right here, okay? Let me erase that. Let's change colors. So this is right here. We can see it's the halfway point because it's 4 units. And this is also 4 units. And that was at 1, right? The x coordinate 1, so it's at 1, 0. This is the midpoint, but it's also the average of those x coordinates. So that we were saying that's 1. What are the coordinates of the midpoint AB? We already said that was 1, 0, which we could just take the average of the two endpoints. So that's pretty simple. With the horizontal lines, we just look at the x values and we take the values of those endpoints. Okay, pretty simple. I mean, there's no middle for the y coordinates because it's just staying on that 0 line, right? Okay, so now we have a vertical line. So it's going to say, well, let's find out what the midpoint is here. What are the coordinates, the y coordinates of B and C? So now we're looking at the y. Why are we looking at the y coordinates? Well, probably because it's a vertical line, so we're going to use the midpoints. So what are the y coordinates? They are at -2 and at 4, and the average of that would be -2 plus 4 divided by 2. That is equal to 1 again, right? And the halfway point, if we look at that halfway point, let's go 1, 2, 3, and then here we've got 1, 2, 3. Okay, so this is right where that halfway point is, right here. That is at 1. Okay, so this is 3 units, and this is 3 units. So we know that's the midpoint. So it's at y is 1 is the coordinate. What are the coordinates of the midpoint? That is 0, 1. And so really the midpoint and the average of the endpoints, the y values, is going to give us that midpoint, right? So if we have a vertical line, a lot like what we saw with a horizontal line, we can just take the average of those endpoints, right? We don't need to manually graph it and go ahead and count them out. We can see that it's the average, right? All right, so there's our midpoint, and that was at 0, 1, right? Okay, so now we've got a diagonal line, so that's a little tricky because if I'm going to try to find the midpoint of that diagonal line, I mean, I could get a ruler out and measure it, but what can we do here? So let's follow the investigation. Graph the midpoint of AC. So that would be our horizontal component of the line right here, right? So the difference in the x values. Where would that midpoint be? Well, first of all, we have at -3 and 2, right? And this one is at 5 and 2. So we don't need to worry about the 2 because we know it's along that point somewhere. So the average, and I could step this out, but the average would be just the same as we saw previously in the previous one where we had a similar example, but it was at 0, okay? So the average between -3 and 5, okay, is going to be at 1. So right here is our midpoint there. Okay, so somewhere down here, okay? It looks like that's where it's going to be. So that is our middle of our horizontal change, okay, for the x value. The average is going to be 1, right? And this one right here was at 2, okay? So that's where that line is. That's where this midpoint is. And I know it's going to be down here somewhere, okay? Now, so that, what is the average of the two? I already said what it was equal to 1. And how does this relate to our answer in A? What does he see? The midpoint of A is 1, so it's the same, the average again. The average of the x values. That gives us the x coordinate, right? Now, if we look at BC, I'm going to change colors now. So BC, what's the average there? Okay, well, I have to put this one in here. This is at 5, -4. So if we're looking at this vertical line here, what's the average between 2? So here I'm going to write it down. 2 plus -4, and we divide by 2. That is going to be -2 over 2, so -1. So that is going to be here, right? Right here. So this is at 5 and -1. Okay. Now, what we have is our midpoint that would line up there, right? So our midpoint here is going to be at, for the x value, we know it's 1, okay? And our y value is at -1, okay? Now, how do we do that? I mean, really what we're doing is we're finding the averages of the x coordinates and the averages of the y coordinates, okay? So that kind of gives us this point here where we have that midpoint, okay? So how do we do that? We looked at the horizontal component, then we looked at the vertical component. In other words, we're taking the averages of the x values and the averages of the y values. Okay, so at this point, if you feel like you kind of got the basic idea, you could just move on and go ahead and start working on the assignment, okay? And if you want to look at a few more examples I'll show further in this video, then you're welcome to stay and do that as well. All right, so let's go ahead and find the midpoint between A and B without graphing. And we know from the investigation that we could just take the averages of the x values to get that horizontal midpoint there, and then the average of the y values to get that midpoint, okay? And then wherever we are, so let's say this is our line, okay? We're going to get that midpoint here by combining the averages of the y values and the averages of the x values, okay? So here we've got an x and a y. Here we've got an x and a y. Okay, so what is my coordinate? Well, really, it's just the averages of the x's. So I've got -2 plus -5 divided by 2. That's my x coordinate, right? That's my x value for the midpoint, right? And then I've got the average of the y values, which would be 1 plus 4 divided by 2, which, in this case, the midpoint of AB, I'm going to say m of AB is equal to -2 plus a -5, that's -7/2. Now it's not an integer, and then this is 5/2. Okay, so these are not exact values, so it would be difficult to do that on a graph because you'd have to kind of estimate in between those points, right? All right, so I'll leave you to try this example, and you can compare with the answer key that I've put at the bottom. And then you can, these are both optional, but you can start working on the assignment for this week.